Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, an IFS-informed trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from guests all around the world as they share their impactful stories and deliver hope and inspiration through their personal post-traumatic growth. We explore and discuss resources and coping strategies to support the survivor community to thrive in their own healing journeys. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah. I have with me today Martine Kalaw, and she is here. We're so happy to have her. She is our guest, and her story reads like this. She has experienced life as a Black immigrant woman, undocumented, and a stateless survivor. Martine is now a TEDx speaker and a published author. She was born in Zambia. She lived in the DR of Congo until the age of 4 when she immigrated into the United States, which she now calls her home. Her first book is called Illegal Among Us, A Stateless Woman's Quest for Citizenship. And this is a memoir that recounts Martine's 7-year battle of deportation to DR Congo and beating an immigration court system that was designed for her to fail. Her latest book that's out now is called The ABCs of Diversity, A Manager's Guide to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the New Workplace. She understands firsthand the implications of being excluded and marginalized in society, but attending a private school and getting access to golden opportunities in life, despite her disadvantages, have exposed her to both ends of the spectrum. It helped her to develop empathy towards each person's perspective. Having been able to navigate these different worlds, she's now on a mission to bridge the gap between these worlds. She has also appeared before the U.S. Congress to advocate for other immigrants. She's now the founder and CEO of Martine Kalaw Enterprises, a firm that offers strategy development, implementation, and education to help organizations overcome unconscious beliefs and implicit bias. Her mission is to help create a sense of belonging that fosters monetary growth and advancement for employees and their organizations. Martine, thank you so much for joining us today. What a bio. You've done so many things. Can we start from the beginning? Tell us a little bit about, your immigration story, and you beat the court system. Tell us about this.
Like you read, I was born in Zambia, came to the US on a visitor's visa with my mother when I was 4 years old. So I was like a little picture in the back of her passport. My mother remarried. My mother and my biological father were from DR Congo. So on our way to the US, we immigrated to the Congo for a few years. Came to the US where my mother's family was. They were here prior and they were established because they were trying to pursue the American dream. So my mother was the last of her siblings to come, and she brought me. And to make the long story short, my mother remarried my stepfather, who was, for all intents and purposes, my dad, like the best father ever. He was an American-born US citizen. And everything, I had a pretty good childhood until the first shoe dropped when I was 13. My stepfather passed away, and then my mother became ill shortly thereafter. She was a green card holder, so a permanent resident, and she was in the process of securing her US citizenship because I was helping her study for her exam. And within a year and a half after my stepfather died, my mother died, so I became orphaned. And in that moment, I did not know, but I was placed in, I became undocumented and stateless and didn't even know that until years later. I navigated. For that short time, I was just trying to survive, and I was able to get myself into boarding school and college. And it wasn't until my freshman year, first year of college, when I went with a college administrator to adjust my non-working Social Security status, that I was placed in deportation proceedings, and I found out that I was undocumented and also stateless because the country that I was born in, Zambia, didn't recognize me as a citizen, so I couldn't be deported there. My mother and biological father's country of birth, Democratic Republic of the Congo, did not recognize me as a citizen, so I couldn't get deported there. And of course, I was not wanted in the US. So there was my 7-year battle of establishing my status. And I think just to kind of encapsulate why this conversation is so apropos to your podcast is because, the trauma didn't just happen because of being stateless and not having a country, having an identity or identifier like a family. That's one way you identify yourself. You identify yourself by, the nation or the country you're associated with, the paperwork you have. And when you don't have any of those things, it's like, do you even exist? But that wasn't the trauma. The trauma was actually going into that courtroom where my case was mishandled in a myriad of ways. There was a lot of malpractice, but the judge who was presiding over my case, he had been removed from the Miami courts for his bias towards Haitian refugees and Black immigrants, and conveniently redirected to a new court in Buffalo, and did not appreciate people like myself, and abhorred people like myself. And then on top of that, with all the malpractice that was occurring with my lawyers presenting evidence in the 11th hour, he took it out on me and said I deserved to be deported. I was a horrible human being and things like that. So that was another layer of trauma. I was terrified of him. Like, I was diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Just every time I went into that courtroom, I would hyperventilate. I would have anxiety attacks. I needed to have, take medication so I could just calm down, just to navigate that courtroom. And then the other reason that it was so hard to be in that courtroom was because I had to relive all of the abuse and trauma and experience and the pain that I experienced from my mother, from my aunts, right? I had to relive that in the courtroom to fight for my own case, and talk about all these horrific things that I experienced from from my dead mother and my dead aunt and all those things, and have to excavate all those feelings that I hadn't really navigated through, and then have a judge accuse me of being a liar. I mean, that's what was traumatic for me. And to do that for 7 years was really, really, it was beyond trying, I would say.
I'm so sorry for your parents passing. When you said that they passed, you were then an orphan after that, and then you continued to move through the world into boarding school, into college. How did you do this? And did you have the space to actually grieve at that time, or were you just so focused on moving forward?
Yeah, no, there wasn't. I didn't grieve until probably 10 years ago, right? So that's, that was a huge span of time from the time my mother and stepfather died. So I was truly surviving. It was, to me, and I think to most children, losing your mother is like the worst thing that could possibly happen. Like, nobody ever, it's like your worst nightmare. You don't even want to think about it, no matter how horrible or wonderful your mother is. Like, that is your lifeline. And so to have lost my stepfather, who was my buffer, I mean, my mother was, she was verbally abusive. She had moments where she battered me, she was dealing with a lot of her own pain and demons and things like that, right? For so many reasons. And her own trauma that she just didn't, back in the early 90s, there wasn't, therapy was more taboo. Like, mental health was not a thing, so she did, not to excuse her behavior, but there was no outlet for her to get and seek therapy, or at least she wasn't aware of that. So when my stepfather was my buffer, he was the best person in my life. So when he died, I did feel I felt abandoned. I would not I did, and alone to face this monster in a way, and who was my mother. And but when she became ill, she was no longer this monster. She was this fragile person that I needed to protect and take care of and try to resuscitate, because I couldn't lose her. She was the only person I had. So when she passed away, and to watch her die, I mean, I was her caretaker, right? At 14, 15, I'm watching them, and you're counting the days, and you're just kind of like, just hoping that it doesn't happen, but you know that shoe's going to drop, you feel it. And so that was, beyond painful. I think when I think back to my entire life and my immigration story, all of that, I think it's that part, watching my mother die was probably, it's the part of my history that's the most painful to even remember, right? But it's important to remember that because as the aftermath of that was truly just survival, because I was then tossed from one relative's home to another, my mother's siblings, and there was a lot of, I experienced neglect, I experienced abuse, and then there were some family members who were not, they were not abusive, but they were just, they were bystanders, right? They didn't say or do anything and just sort of let things happen. So for me, it was really just a matter of survival for a long time. And when I finally got myself into boarding school, it was happenstance. I mean, it was just another one of those days where I was working in my aunt's consignment shop, and she decided that she was going to take me out of school at 16 years old and have me work for her. And a neighborhood that was, that compromised my safety, and by myself behind the cash register. And just that one day, this lovely, beautiful angel of a woman walked into my aunt's consignment store, and something must have told her, I was not in the right, this was not the right environment for me, because she asked me if I ever considered boarding school. I mean, this is a stranger. And from that, point on, I mean, it's a pretty long and beautiful and compelling and traumatic story, but I got myself, I got into boarding school from that experience, and then I never went back home, right, to my family. And so it really was about surviving, making sure that I stayed away from my family, making sure that I was able to get these individuals who were investing in me to see my value. So I always had to show up and be polite, be smart, be sweet, like always have to have a certain facade, because I needed people to see that I was worth something. So there was never a time where I could be sad or grieve or feel pain, because I needed to survive. So to answer your question, it really was about survival. And the grief came years later, many, many years later.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Are you still in contact? Do you know who that woman was that came into the shop that day?
I've been trying to find her for years. I don't. I mean, I know her name. I've researched everywhere. But maybe maybe her intention was just to come in, you know, help move me along, and that's all. She doesn't want the credit. I mean, because I have tried, I've reached out, I wrote a book. I was hoping that maybe she'll see the book and read it and say, but she did save my life. Her random act of kindness um changed my whole life trajectory.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
incredible. Incredible. What a story.
Yeah.
And it just makes me think, how many times do we get that like urge and we swallow it down? Like if you get an
Right.
urge to say something or hug someone or ask them if they're okay or ask them about a boarding school, do
Right.
it.
Do it.
Do
Because
it.
to her, she probably thought, oh, I asked this young woman and this little girl, and then she then followed up with my aunt, and then just connected me to an organization of Black women that help children, young Black kids, get into private schools. And to her, she probably thought, hey, that was the least I could do. I'm done. Like, you know what? But it changed my whole life. And I wish I could tell her that, I wish she knew
Mm.
how
Oh.
much of an impact she had on my entire life.
Now here you are. You have now since written a book. You have started your own enterprise company consultation for other organizations working in diversity and outreach in that way. You've also spoken in front of Congress. So I am very curious. Going to speak to the Congress after you have had so much of this legal trauma, this horrible judge who just did not see your value at all. And now you're going to go and speak at the Congress. Where did you muster that courage, that bravery, or was it just something just really natural for you?
I have to be honest, because I think that, when you hear, whether some people refer to it like as the story of triumph, the hero's journey, whatever it is, I remember always hearing other people talk about how they had the courage and the resiliency and they did it. And I just always thought, like, I don't know that I have that courage. I never did. I don't see it. Maybe I don't, maybe I'm modest. I wouldn't consider it courage. It just, for me, and I think for sometimes for many people when they're just surviving, it's not about courage, right? It's leaning on community. Sometimes it's the community that pushes you forward. Like I said, I was in a place where I was in a very dark place for many years in my life. I didn't have courage. That was the last thing I was thinking about. It was just, I guess I have to survive. And then when I wanted to give up, it was taking it each day, one day at a time. And thankfully, I had someone in my corner, a friend or someone that just um, would just remind me to hang on one more day. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe tomorrow will be different. So that's really what I hung on to, maybe. And when I went to speak, on in Congress, it was because I had exercised every other possibility in terms of my case. I was pretty sure that it was over. Like I was going to end up not just deported, because when you're stateless, there's no place, no country's going to take you. So I was just pretty sure that I was going to end up in a detention facility indefinitely. And if that were to happen, I was also, just knowing me and my wherewithal, I knew that I wasn't going to make it. I knew that either psychologically I wouldn't come out of it the same person that I was going in. Physically, I mean, we hear about different things, human rights atrocities that happen in these detention facilities. I just knew that. Like, I just kind of knew, I could sort of see my future, and I knew it was going to end up really bad. So there was no courage in it. It was just, at the time, my attorney said, like, we have nothing to lose at this point. Yeah. And at the very least, we need the US to know, like, there are people like you out there, who are not trying to harm anyone. You're trying to just survive. You're a victim of circumstances, right? You didn't ask for your mother, your stepfather to die. Like, none of this was your fault. And so people need to know that part of the immigration story too. And so for me, it wasn't about courage. It was about maybe legacy. It was about, I need somebody to know that I existed, and I don't want to just be like a line in a news article or statistics saying that this many undocumented immigrants, are in detention. Like, I didn't want that. So it was really around that. So I cannot take the credit for the actions. It was just reactive. It was through the encouragement of my community. And it was because there were no other possibilities. This was the only route. Certainly, I guess I could have said no, but when you're in a space where such a dark space, even no seems like it's work. Nothing seems easy, even no, like, it's all work either way. You're going to have to do something. You can't just sit there. So I made a decision to speak on my own behalf and on the behalf of others.
Yeah, for sure. The ones who maybe had already been in the detention center, the ones who had already lost cases, the ones who had lost that voice, or who
And the
now
ones
are,
who were also fighting, and the Dream Act at the time. And yes, absolutely. It was a matter of just speaking and saying, like, we have a voice, where we're not voiceless, and we have stories, and they're not that far removed from your stories. Like, what would happen if anyone at 13 to 15, if they lost their mom and dad? Anything could happen, right? It just happened to be that I also, the countries that I called home also didn't recognize me in
Mm-hmm.
addition to that. And then one of those countries was war torn. So these are circumstances that I cannot control.
Yeah. 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 To remind the people that you have a voice and that you are human. This is a story behind this, that
Human
you're not
story.
a number. So I do applaud that for you. And I can totally understand what you mean by it being more of an act of reactivity and survival, I think are the words that you said, rather than courage or bravery.
Yeah,
On the other side of it and looking at your life and looking into it, it
sure.
seems really stinking brave. But I can totally appreciate that was just something you felt like you needed to do. Your company now that you have,
Yeah.
you work on inclusion and diversity in the workplace, and you've written a book about it now, the ABCs. What are some of the most important concepts that organizations and corporations can create this inclusion, is to have this healthy workplace?
Yeah, I mean, just to keep it straightforward, I mean, the reason I do this is because it stemmed from even my work around, my experiences, my personal experiences around immigration, is that, in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, there's always this dichotomy, and I want to be a bridge builder, like to bridge a build between these two worlds, or people who exist in different worlds. And those who have more accessibility to not see those who don't as needing help as charity, but as investments, right? There's a value and everybody can benefit, right? And so that's my goal. And I do that in the corporate workspaces, because I feel like the workspace is a microcosm for the world. And if we can't get it right in the world, everybody goes to work. So let's start in the workplace. So I keep it simple, just like, my book, The ABCs of Diversity. It really, there are a couple of concepts. I think that when we get so hung up on language and verbiage and, being politically correct, we miss out on the fundamentals of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about listening, asking questions, and asking permission to ask questions. I mean, that's like just one thing that we can all do, is that. Two is validating and understanding someone doesn't mean we agree with them, right? And so that's what we get to do when we engage in these difficult or courageous conversations around race, ethnicity, gender, equity, these really difficult conversations that it might be for us. We don't have to agree with the other person. We can just listen. We can just hear them and say, I hear what you're saying. It doesn't mean that we agree. If we could do a little bit more of that, then we can engage a little bit further into the conversation. And and then in terms of how it looks like in an organization, keep it also really simple. One, I do believe that, we are at a critical impasse in the way we approach diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not enough for organizations for us to argue that it's a nice to have, or that it's the right thing to do. It's also the smart business thing to do, right? I mean, when we have business to business companies, or business to consumer organizations, what will drive revenue is if we begin to find ways to tap into new markets, learn to retain and connect with different customers and consumers. If we have investors, how do we connect with those investors? What's important to those investors? Who's supporting and supplying those investors, right? So all of those things are important, and that stems from diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so that's why it's more than just the right thing to do. It's the smart business thing to do. So that's one. Two, when we think about hiring, promotions, attrition, which are the fundamentals of the work that managers and human resources have to do, right? These are the two, like these are the components of these two groups. It all ties into diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so there's that. So inclusion has to be incorporated into fundamental management practices in the workplace. So that's the second thing, right? And then the last thing is that numbers are important. And I would say more than, more specifically, analytics are important when we're looking at DEI in the workplace. We have to have a framework, a baseline. So it's not, looking at numbers is not about scrutinizing what a business isn't doing. It's really about figuring out, where do we want to go? How do we want to grow our business? And how does DEI play into that? So what is that baseline, and what are our targets rather than quotas? So that's the work that I do, right? So it's those three things, those three business decisions encapsulated in, the soft skills, which I mentioned earlier, right? It's really about understanding and listening rather than trying to agree and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. Basic. I like how you called it fundamental management principles, right? Like
Yeah.
that only makes sense to translate that from being a good, inclusive human being and recognizing other people's humanness. All of
Right.
that would translate into the workplace. But I like how you're flipping it, and you're in the workplace hoping that this translates outside also,
Outwardly.
because like you said, everyone goes to work. That's really
Right.
brilliant. As a nation, so outside, can I take you outside of the workforce? So do you feel like we're trending in the right way as a nation as a whole, from human to human side? And what can we do better as non-BIPOC people? What can we be doing better in the movement of anti-racism?
Are we trending in the right way? That's a loaded question. I think that it depends on, I think sometimes, maybe performatively we are. So, there's a lot of performance. And then we've got pockets of people we've got performative people, we've got people who truly care and genuinely care. And then we've got those who don't care, right? And so we just have to find a way to, we've got to find a way to get everyone in our country to understand the value of each other. And I mean, diversity is here to stay. I mean, let's be clear. It's been around, it is, and we look at the landscape of our country, it's here, but is it being embraced? Is it being acknowledged? Do people see the value? Not everyone. So there's a question mark around, are we going in the right direction? There's a question mark. I mean, we can see it politically, we see it socially, right? For every stride we make, there's a story where we hear that things are not going the way we want, right? And there's some sort of social unrest or social injustice. So I think that we've got work to do. We've got work to do. And we can't get to equality until we get to equity. And we can't get to equity until we start to talk about what diversity is and inclusion is, right? So we've got a way to go. But the fact that we're even talking about it is a start. And as far as the non-BIPOC community, I think having this kind of dialogue is a first. I mean, just being able to engage in these discussions is the first thing, the first step. When people don't acknowledge this exists, or when I hear, non-BIPOC individuals who say, well, we had Obama as president, we're fine, or, oh, I can't believe this is happening in America. The America, 5 years ago wasn't like this. Like, where have you been? All right. So I think the acknowledgement is the first thing, but not just acknowledgement is no longer sufficient. Active allyship. And I think that part can be really intimidating, because for all of us, I mean, there's so many causes out there. We can feel like overwhelmed. I mean, I'm just one person. What can I do? You don't have to go and march down in Washington, or to be an active ally. Active allyship really means when you're in the workplace and you see something or hear something that does not sit right with you, or you're just not sure if you observe others and you check in to see, How are they doing? How are they feeling? When such and such, in that last, team meeting, do you feel like everyone, were all of your colleagues, did they all get a, do they all feel like they have a fair, fair treatment? Do they feel like they have the same opportunities in terms of sharing and speaking in these team meetings? And if not, is there anything you can do, right? I mean, could you, also share your platform with them, so when you're speaking, you ask them to step in and jump in and say something, right? These are small things, but they go a long way. So that's what active allyship can look like. It doesn't mean that we have to go and write an article in the Washington Post or the New York Times around racial equity or any of those things. It can be that acknowledgement, right? And that first step in doing something and in saying something, or even asking, I just want to check in, colleague, how are you doing? And lastly, and sometimes, some listeners might be thinking, well, how do I check in? How do I even know that, how do I know everything seems fine? And what I can tell you is, if, step out of the body that you're in and put yourself in a different body, right? If you're non-BIPOC, put yourself in the body of a, right? And imagine, and then look outwardly in your workspace. And if you'll realize that, in that different body, you're only one of maybe a few, right? And if you're one of a few, chances are your experience is not the same as everyone else's, the majority. And from there, I think that just offers a level of perspective. And that's where you can start.
It's so helpful to hear your story because it inspires so many others. So I want to just honor and acknowledge your story and your ability to have brought yourself through in a survival state, but moving forward with so much advocacy now, so much fire and passion, and you can hear that. So I just want to honor you for that. And I just want to thank you for joining us today. Before I let you go, I want to honor your time, but before I let you go, we just like to ask everyone, you've created these beautiful resources now to help organizations. You've written books, you're speaking in front of Congress, you're advocating for other immigrants and stateless people. What was really helpful? What was catalyst in your healing journey? What were some resources that you had that really helped you through?
Yeah, I always say three, because when it's easy to be in a situation where you feel downtrodden and you lose dignity. For me, it's the dignity piece. And we can lose it in a myriad of ways, because we're not part of the majority and we don't feel valued. And whether we're, stateless and undocumented or not, we can lose dignity. And so for me, what resuscitated me, I would say, were three things. One was mental health support, right? When I had a therapist who really understood the climate of being stateless and undocumented, and she understood what that experience of going into a courtroom with an immigration judge was like, without me having to explain. So she had the education and the knowledge. It was such a relief, and I felt like I wasn't alone. So she was the first resource. The second was, for me, it was my attorney. For somebody else, it might be an ally, right? But it was how my attorney or ally treated me. She didn't treat me like she was my savior. She treated me like a partner, like someone who she valued my opinions, my ideas, and brought me into my own case. And we were solving it together, with her being my advocate, of course, but she was not my savior. And so that empowered me, and that gave me agency to use my own voice. Second. And the third was truly an active ally, a friend. who was my community. This is the person who came with me to my meetings with my attorney in case I was so emotional and I couldn't process what my attorney was saying. She would go to me to my hearings. For somebody else, it may not look like that if you're not in the immigration context, but it might be someone who goes with you to your next doctor's appointment because, it's just so much to take in, and, or you don't feel like you have your doctor's taking you seriously. So you've got a friend who's there to help advocate and navigate the conversation with you, right? It can look like a number of things, but having my friend there, my support system made a world of a difference. So those three people, they were my team, right? And I became the CEO of my own dilemma and trauma, and then was able to move from it. And so that gave me agency to have a team. And that also gave me a sense of dignity. I wasn't alone. I had a voice, I had a team. And that's kind of how I approach and encourage anyone I mentor to navigate their world, is within the same framework or context.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Thank you again, Martine, for joining us today. Let people know where they can find you, where they can reach out and connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. You can just find me on my website at martinekalaw.com. And that's where you can find all the information around my books and my social media and so forth.
Amazing. And we're going to have that and all your socials linked up in the show notes below. Thank you again for joining us today. Continue on. You're doing an amazing job advocating and fighting and helping other people. This has been a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
You're so welcome. Bye.
Thank you for listening or watching this episode of Trauma Survivorhood. For more info, show notes, and links, check out the episode guide below. Until next time, be well, survivors.